So everyone, please follow me. 起立，面向后仰，三下三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，三下各位给传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下，please be seated. Bill, we are good to go. I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone.
All righty. Thanks, Derek, and everybody. It's a joy to see everyone here this morning. Oh, pardon me. It's cold and flu season in Indiana, and so true to form, I have a bit of a cold going on, a little touch of the sniffles. It is a gray, overcast, but 51-degree day here in Indianapolis, and after a couple of weeks of 20 and 30-degree weather, that's a remarkably wonderful change. It's raining and kind of gray, but nice and peaceful. This morning, I want to talk a bit about suffering. I speak fairly frequently about suffering from one perspective or another. This particular talk is actually more about how not to suffer than it is about suffering. Suffering is actually pretty easy. Not suffering can be somewhat more difficult depending on one's circumstances. And I really wished I knew how to make that not do that. The reason that I picked this topic for this talk is because of chapter 46 of the Daodejing. And it struck me as being amazingly simple and yet amazingly profound, the two perspectives presented in this chapter. And it's not like I haven't read this hundreds of times previously, but for some reason, last week while I was considering what I was going to talk about today, I read through this and saw it in something of perhaps a new light, a different light, a deeper understanding. I don't know. It was just more interesting. And so, although it's a very short verse, it contains an awful lot of really useful information. We may not get through all of this today, but that's okay. Hopefully, we'll all be here next week as well. Chapter 46 of the Daodejing says, when the world has the Tao, fast horses are retired to till the soil. When the world lacks the Tao, war horses give birth on the battlefield. There is no crime greater than greed, no disaster greater than discontentment, no fault greater than avarice. Thus, the satisfaction of contentment is the lasting satisfaction. This is a wonderfully powerful chapter, and before we launch into the presentation proper, I'm going to do something else I very rarely to never do, and that's call your attention to differences in the level of expertise regarding translations and interpretations of the Daodejing. Chapter 46 of the Daodejing is perhaps one of the most egregiously interpreted chapters in the entire publication. There is one translation out there in particular, the name of which I won't mention, that quotes the first section as saying that when a country holds on to the Tao, factories make trucks and tractors. When a country goes contrary to the Tao, warheads are stockpiled outside the city. I find it difficult to compare trucks and tractors with horses, and I'm not sure where Lao Tzu put warheads in chapter 46. I'm pretty sure that outside of the very basic uses for black powder, he would have been completely unaware of the concept of a warhead. And things like that make understanding the Daodejing difficult for people. The great deal of poetic license taken with some of what Lao Tzu said obfuscates the real meaning and muddies the waters of understanding. The cultural and language divide between East and West makes that process difficult enough all on its own without any help from well-meaning translators and interpreters. And when someone goes so far afield with an interpretation, the entire meaning, the entire point of the chapter is lost. And to that end, not only do I want to talk about the chapter, but about the meanings. The contrasting conditions presented by Lao Tzu in chapter 46 are those of warfare versus farming. And those are two things that people in Lao Tzu's time would have known really well. Most of the people in China during Lao Tzu's time would have been agrarian in some way. They would have been farmers, tillers of the land, or they'd have been very close to the land. They would have manufactured things that all came from the land. 2,500 years ago, the concept of mass production was in its infancy at best. And although the Chinese historically did remarkably well in terms of figuring out manufacturing processes and efficiencies and optimizing projects and that sort of thing, while holding on to a high level of quality, it certainly was not the level of technology that we see today, and nobody was manufacturing trucks and tractors. Further, by moving the focus away from a lifestyle that's very close to the land, we lop off half of this contrast. The point of chapter 46 is not the warheads and trucks and tractors or horses. It's what happens when the populace hang on to the Tao teachings and when they do not. It is the difference between a population engaged in warfare or victimized by warfare and a population engaged in farming. It is the picture of the world with and without the Tao. And the reason for this is pretty simple to see. We're drawing an analogy to things that were well known, right? And there are attributes to farming and warfare both that are, to this day, very stark, extremely realistic, and easy to pick out. Warfare and farming are certainly both vocations. People engage in those activities to this very day, right? But one of those vocations is creative. It's beneficial to everything around it. It helps to feed the entire population of actually, in our case, more than one country. And the other vocation, of course, is destructive. It doesn't create, it consumes. And it consumes everything that it touches. The supplies, the materials, even the people. One of those vocations is beneficial to a family, a town, a country, a whole group of people. And the other clearly is not. Right? The core difference here is that farmers live. Warriors try to survive. And metaphorically speaking, that's the difference between the world with the Tao and the world without. The population that holds the teachings dear and those who do not. And it's the difference between living and surviving. And this sets the stage. It lays the foundation for everything to come in the second section of this chapter. So, as far as interpretation and translation goes, authentic is better. Derek's translation, the Daodejing Annotated and Explained, It is far and away the best translation I've ever read, and I've read several. And in this particular case, remaining close to what the original text said is fairly critical to understanding the lessons contained in the text. So why even talk about this? Why do we have to put on a talk over the world with and without the Tao, and the differences between warfare and farming? You know, that ought to be something that's fairly common sense. And why in the dickens would we title a talk "Suffering" when that may not even be what the chapter is about? You know, well, let's find out. See, the presence or absence of the Tao and the presence or absence of the teachings in the population affect the people exactly like engaging in the vocations of warfare or farming affect the people. Okay. Where the Tao teachings prevail, where there's some form of sound spiritual path at work amongst the population, amongst the people, people are content and can live in peace. They don't live in fear. They're not worried about soldiers kicking in their front doors and quartering troops in their homes, or taking off with their possessions, or, you know, shooting everything up and dropping bombs all over. All of the various wonderful things that fighting a full-scale war brings with it. People in America are remarkably fortunate. Outside of our own Civil War, no country has ever really invaded the United States, and no country's invaded us in all of the years that any of us can remember. And so, fortunately or not, that gives us somewhat of a detached view of what warfare really does. But all over the rest of the world, you know, there are people who have been touched and recently touched by the effects of warfare. And those effects are long-lasting, far-reaching, and horrible in every way. To this very day, in parts of the Middle East, there are large tracts of land where people cannot go because they're sprinkled richly with landmines from one end to the other. And the presence of those landmines robs people of their legs and kills them. And since they can't find them without stepping on them, it's too doggone dangerous to go there. Where those areas are known, they're roped off and avoided. Where they're not known, they're stumbled upon by people who don't know that there are mines there. And some of those devices were planted 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. We don't have that here. Okay? But there are people who do. When one lives in an area where just walking out the front door may be the event that gets you killed today, it changes your mental perspective. And it isn't just the combatants who are altered in that way. The civilian population also lives under the shadow of that stress. It is extremely difficult to be contented and at peace when people a couple of miles away from you are lobbing mortar rounds over the wall towards you. Where the Tao teachings are not held in the hearts of the people, where there's no sound, uplifting spiritual path helping to guide the choices and decisions of the people, where warfare prevails, there is suffering and strife and want in the population. And there is nothing that can be done short of ceasing the warfare to reverse that condition. Additionally, even if there's not an active war being fought, in the absence of that sound spiritual path, those uplifting teachings, that better set of answers, people become unduly competitive. Compassion is forgotten, abandoned, discarded very often. People become self-serving, not because perhaps they want to, but because it's necessary to survive or to take care of one's family. In short, people become survivors. They go from a state of living, from a state of contentedness and joyfulness and peacefulness, to a stressed out condition of trying to preserve their lives, the lives of their families, and to maintain the status quo. It's exactly the same state that one sees in those who are in a combat zone, military combatants. One of the reasons that military personnel returning from overseas have to be debriefed and decompressed, if you will, prior to re-entering civilian life is because going through the things that occur in war alters them to the state very often where they're not completely prepared to be reintegrated into a civilian society. It takes some time, takes some counseling, it takes perhaps medical care, and that's if they're not injured. Okay. When the Tao teachings do not prevail in the land, where that sound spiritual path is not, sooner or later, the strong rise up against the weak. Greed, avarice, and discontent and suffering follow in the wake of that, just as surely as night follows day. And it doesn't take very long for that to happen. In the New York blackout, in the LA blackout, as soon as the lights went out, law and order started to dissolve. The longer the lights are out, the longer the status quo is not preserved, the worse those problems get. Looting and rioting, burning, carrying on all sorts of untoward behaviors come out in those conditions where individuals feel that the anonymity of the night gives them the excuse to do whatever they want. We don't have to leave the borders of the continental United States to see what happens where the Tao teachings are not. All we have to do is wait for the next time there's a blackout in New York. So, if we are to have peace and hope and contentment, first we got to have the better set of answers. And this is why Lao Tzu says that the greatest crime is greed. The greatest disaster is pardon me. I think he said, I'm getting old and senile and I don't want to misquote it, discontentment, and the greatest fault, avarice. The wonderful thing, though, is that we don't have to be stuck there. I promise this wasn't going to be a talk about all suffering. But I think it's important to understand the aspects of suffering so that we can understand how not to suffer, at least in this context. So what causes these two really disparate sets of effects? Those of the farmer and those of the warrior. Well, the number one item on my list every time is unmoderated desires and unchecked and undisciplined attachments. I'm a firm believer in the supposition that our desires and our attachments are our primary sources of suffering and trouble. In an environment where the desires are not moderated and the attachments are allowed to run rampant, we create and provide ourselves with an environment where greed and selfishness prevail over our better sense of judgment, because they can. And they will. And we can see that over and over and over again in the behavior of our fellow man, sometimes in ourselves. Right? I have a couple of grandchildren that are under the age of 10. One of them is 4, and my son's girlfriend has a 2-year-old daughter. They're absolutely precious. And none of them understand the concepts of greed and avarice. But the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old absolutely understand the concept of mine. And everything is mine to both of them. When we become adults, we don't lose that. We still know the concept of mine. Our unmoderated desires and unchecked attachments provide conditions where we can cultivate avarice, where avarice seems to be okay and extremes get to be the norm. Those things, along with our ego selves, persuade us that all of the bad things that happen on our streets and between people and their relationships are okay. They help us to become desensitized to the rather deplorable conduct of our fellow man, and in that way help us to get trapped into the illusions of power and ownership and control that cause us to do the same doggone things. To kick compassion and selflessness out the front door, close up the gates and start watching out for me. And to a point in the Tao teachings, there's not a problem with taking care of ourselves. Master William taught me very early on that if I don't take care of myself and my family first, I won't have the ability to take care of anybody else's. That is the ability to give in that Tao-centric way. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are the extremes. The things that cause us to abandon the higher self for the sake of having what we want or what we think we need. And it doesn't have to be in the context of robbing and stealing and rioting and looting. In fact, that's very rarely how those things get started. They get started with a little overspending here, a little collection of junk over there, hanging on to this, that, or the other thing, whether it's stuff or thoughts or behaviors or habits. And from those seeds grow the mighty oak trees of all kinds of problems. So where do we get to the non-suffering part? Well, that's here. Where the Tao teachings prevail, where there are people who have their feet set on that sound spiritual path, that way of uplifting themselves and others, that path of everyone's highest and best good. Their desires and attachments are held in check by the two things that we preach about more than anything else: moderation and self-discipline. Because those things are moderated, the ego self is kind of given a back seat. The ego self no longer runs the railroad. Our reason and an open heart do that. It makes greed give way to compassion. It means that avarice is replaced by selflessness, and that discontent is supplanted by the knowledge of what's enough and when to stop. When a person follows the path of the Tao, contentment returns to the life, not because there's an excess of anything, but because there is enough, and its satisfaction is enduring because there is enough. Contentment is kind of a yardstick, if you will, of the state of our spiritual cultivation. Okay? Because if we can truly be content and comfortable about anywhere that we are, it means that we understand a few things, such as that everything that we have and everyone we know and all we're ever going to see or touch or taste or anything else is transient and impermanent. If it exists in this existence, it's gonna go away sometime. Even the people that we hold dearest, our spouses, our children, our friends, as will we one day, they're going to die. And that's not a horrible, hair-rending, sackcloth-wearing event. It's simply a part of living. Okay? Without knowing and understanding contentment at that level, we can't ever get past the stuff. We can't ever give up the attachments. We can't ever let go of the desires. If I had my druthers, if I could have any desire I wanted, I'd want to live as long as my wife will. I'm not gonna. And it's gonna hurt her when I die. But we're going to have a wonderful life between now and then. And because of that, there's contentment. A contented heart can be comfortable anywhere it is. That's one of the secrets to the cultivation of the Tao teachings, is that a contented heart doesn't depend on external conditions for its happiness, or its peacefulness, or its joy. So at the point where desires and attachments become preferences instead of obsessions, contentment can take hold and life can start moving on. The effect of that is a much more realistic perspective on one's condition in life. The understanding of what is real and what is not real. It's the ability to be joyous, independent of one's financial position or one's political or social status. A Tao sage doesn't seek status or position or accolades, none of that. Lao Tzu says, don't be shiny like jade, be dull like rocks. That doesn't mean that we accomplish nothing or that we're self-deprecating. Only that we do what we do without a fanfare and a 10-piece band to announce it. Okay? The other effect of contentment is the knowledge that all things pass. This is a huge tenet of not suffering. It's the knowledge that misfortune isn't always terrible and good fortune isn't always great. In short, real heartfelt, joyful contentment is kind of a healthy of the middle of the road perspective on living life. That's what it is. We're not always necessarily born that way, perhaps, or grow up that way, but we can learn. Anyway, kind of summarize that metaphorical use of horses in chapter 46 kind of illustrates, I think, the fields of a person's life. Either a person's tilling the fields in farming, or they're preparing for a conflict. The one thing that I thought over and over and over and over and over as I read through this week, is that when one is farming, one is cultivating the land. When one is practicing the Tao teachings, trying to learn them, trying to understand them, trying to apply them, one is cultivating the teachings in one's life, cultivating the spiritual fields, if you will. And I thought that was the coolest thing I'd come across all week. I still think it's cool. It's one of those little teeny tiny statements, one of those little thoughts that allows me to have a moment of a little extra joy when I think of it. And it's something to remember. We have to choose whether or not we're going to be warriors or farmers, okay? Whether we're going to be cultivators of the fields of the mind and spirit, or whether we're going to destroy the land and all it contains. And that choice is ours. Okay. But the wonderful thing about having choices is that if we figure out that our current set of choices isn't working for us, we can change them anytime we want. We all have the ability to create any future we wish, anytime we want to create it. All we have to do is make the decision and step off down the path. Thank you all very much for letting me chat with you. And as always, I hope something I said might have been useful for somebody. Have a great Sunday.
Bill, thank you so much. First of all, you are quite correct that the many translations that are out there contain outright distortions, like the example that you cited. However, I have a question for you. When you talk about this whole concept of correct translations, authentic teachings, etc., do you sometimes get people who ask you questions or who present a different perspective? Like, for instance, people who say that, Bill, why are you so insistent on authenticity? I mean, yeah, this translation of the Daodejing that I have, probably not perfect, but I like it. It works for me. Why can't that just be my path? You have your path, I have mine. Do you get a question like that sometimes?
No, I get questions like that all the time. The answer always starts out with, well, you can choose that path if you want. However, there's always the however. I said at the beginning of this talk that sometimes the choice of words used in the interpretation and translations can obfuscate the meaning and muddy the waters of understanding. And chapter 46 is a huge example of that. Okay, the translation that talks about tractors and trucks and warheads and what have you, it causes the reader to miss the point. The point's been destroyed. It's not there. And that's the part that worries me. There's a good reason to maintain authenticity and to go for rigor in the translations and study and research in the interpretations, because this stuff's powerful and it means something to people. And if you can't understand what the author really said, then you can't get the real meaning out of it. And that's a problem. It's just that in the West, most people don't realize that the problem exists.
That's right. Now obviously, I agree with you. My observation, Bill, is that people like yourself, and by that I mean people who come to the Tao from having studied Kung Fu, from having been exposed to what people call martial arts and you call martial science. These are the people who tend to prize authenticity more so than the typical person who just picks up a copy of the Daodejing at Barnes & Noble. So for that reason, we have quite a few people in our group who think the same way that you do. Of course, I don't want to put words in their mouths. I don't want to speak on their behalf. They may be able to share with us their own reasons for seeking authenticity. And so as an example, I have my good friend Larry Miller, who's in the meeting right now. He studied martial arts for years and years, and he definitely sees great value on authenticity. I am certainly curious to hear his thoughts on that. Roger, sorry to put you on the spot. You mentioned that you've been studying martial arts for many years as well. When it comes to this particular topic, I would also be very interested in your thoughts on that. You know, whether or not it's important to you, very important, somewhat important. You know, what your thoughts are. Would you mind sharing that?
Absolutely. I look at it from the perspective of three things. There are modern martial artists, or as we can say in this case, Taoists. There are traditional martial artists and Taoists, and then I call a third category that I call the classical. What I've found is that a lot of people get lost in the idea of tradition. You can never be an artist and copy your teacher's art. You must become the artist. You can't follow and become. You have to search and find it yourself. So I actually have a slightly differing opinion that if you get stuck too much on tradition, you'll sometimes not see the classical nature of it, especially in reference to modern times. The modern practitioner tends to not look at the classical things. The traditional only does what they were taught. The classical tries to see both the tradition and the why of the tradition and come to grips with that.
So what I get, all of what you just said, is that it is possible for people to be mired in dogmatic teachings, and they have to do certain things in a certain way, and lose sight of the original essence from the classical teachings.
Yes.
Excellent. Let me also check. You know, we have quite a few people online who have a background in martial arts. So if anyone wants to contribute an opinion, just go ahead and type it out. I'll read that off for the group. So from Larry, from my friend Larry Miller. There is this gentleman I consider just like Bill to be my older brother in the family of the Tao. Authentic, originalist martial arts were created by people who actually had to fight for their lives. It is like the appreciation and valuation of conservative principles. He's referring to political conservative principles. They are time-tested and genuine. So that's of great interest to me. This is something that I know M. Monahan talks about from time to time. He says, just like with anybody else doing anything else, if you've done it over and over and over again, you get really good at it. And so the ancient Chinese, in exploring self-defense, in exploring these techniques on fighting, they do it over and over and over again. They eventually, generation after generation, they get really good at it. And that accounts for the effectiveness. What we're learning is basically distilled from years and years, centuries and centuries of actual experience. Of course, you know, there could always be what Roger was talking about, that people veer off into a very stylistically frozen way of thinking, that you have to spin around 3 times and do a certain pose before you can take this or that action. And the reason why M. Monahan wanted to always emphasize that is because he learned that from Jerry Petit, who learned that from Bruce Lee, that you need to think about fighting from a very fluid perspective, to be like water, which goes back to the classical Tao teachings. So fascinating. And let me also follow up by saying that, so this is a great discussion. Let me follow up by also quoting from Larry, that warning to those who would adhere to the living, breathing art, first learn the authentic forms, internalize them, then augment them with your own personality. The ancients had thousands of years to develop their art. don't be so brash or quick to believe your thoughts are original or better. Okay, great point. And in the Tao teachings, there is an emphasis on mastering the basics before advancing your own form, your own personalized art. And to maybe use Bruce Lee as an example again, he proved himself to be a master of the original Wing Chun arts before he veered off and created his own Jeet Kune Do. So I guess it's that kind of idea. Anyhow, wonderful. This is the kind of discussions that I really look forward to every Sunday.